Hi, I'm Dubber, I'm the Director of Music Tech Fest, and this is the MTF Podcast. Now, something that has been increasingly prevalent in our MTF labs and at Music Tech Fest events in recent months has been artificial intelligence. And it's something that we're going to be going even deeper on in just a couple of weeks. So I thought that this would be a good moment to have a chat with Christian Guttmann. Christian's a scientist and an entrepreneur. He's the founder of the Nordic Artificial Intelligence Institute. He's adjunct and associate professor at the University of New South Wales in Australia in the field of AI, adjunct researcher at the Karolinska Institute, a medical university in Sweden, also in the field of AI. He's written and edited 7 books, over 50 publications, and has registered 4 patents in the field of AI. He's founded and been at the ground level of several startups in healthcare, finance, retail, and music recommendation, all of which use AI and which have been acquired by the likes of Microsoft and IBM. He's a mentor to the CEOs of several AI-based startups and companies, and he's also vice president in charge of AI at Tieto, an IT software and service company with around 15,000 employees in 20 countries. So when it comes to AI, Christian's someone who has a fair idea what he's talking about. We sat down for a chat in Stockholm about clever chess computers, the ability to spot cats in photographs, the inevitable robot uprising and the overthrow and imminent extinction of the human race, and whether we're ultimately okay with that. Here's Christian Guttmann. Christian Guttmann, thank you so much for joining us for the MTF podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you're probably the right person to ask this question. And how do we distinguish neural networks, machine learning, artificial intelligence? Are they subsets of the same thing? Are they overlapping Venn diagrams? Are they completely distinct things? How do you...
So, I mean, the way how I look at it is that artificial intelligence is the broad umbrella term of these different types of subsections. And then you have machine learning as being one of the different subsections. And then below that you have deep learning, for example, or transfer learning or supervised learning, these types of, like approaches. And then you have technologies and neural networks. When you implement them, that would be an AI technology. So tool that you can start using to identify patterns or, look at clusters or use it for reinforcement learning or see, cats in pictures and so on. So that's the way how I would look at it, I guess. And then, yeah.
It's funny how often cats and pictures comes up in this conversation, because my next question is, what's it really for? Because surely finding cats and pictures is something we can already do.
Yeah, exactly. That's pretty well done. And with the event of ImageNet, which was a few years ago, you could actually show that AI is much better in recognizing pictures, like things in pictures. And that's what an AI is much better in doing. And that's not just cats, but pretty much everything else that you can imagine, which will become useful. So, for example, one case that we were pushing and my team was working on at Tieto was in retail. So we have robots that go through the aisles in supermarkets and check what's in the shelves, right? And so if something is missing, so it would detect like bread or other items, right? And then essentially reshelf those items when they're missing. And so detecting those breads and the types of breads and how much is left, that's one of those typical tasks that you can do with neural networks, one of so many, for example. So that would be one. Another one, when it comes to this machine vision, machine learning type approach, I said you can start detect patterns in tunnels, which we also did. You can see if there are abnormalities in these tunnels where cars drive through, and you see, for example, you have lots of video footage of these tunnels, and when you see pedestrians walking through or accidents happening, then you can essentially flag that as being something that's abnormal, that shouldn't happen in these types of tunnels. And that's examples where we have been using neural networks, for example, these types of technologies, together often with other types of technologies, such as sensor fusion or 5G or IoT technologies and so on.
This sounds very much in the realm of things that we can already do without artificial intelligence. And this is really kind of one of the parts where I get confused, is why are we trying to solve problems that we don't have? Or is that a step towards something that artificial intelligence will ultimately be for that we can't yet do?
Well, I think that's the whole idea with AI. As soon as we do AI, we know that that's something we wouldn't call AI anymore, right? So as soon as you're able to perform a certain task, which before you thought would be only doable by humans because they have the capabilities of performing that task, such as chess playing or driving a car and so on. Once you achieve that type of task, you put it in the category of things, that they, an AI can do these types of things. So it's a computer can do that, a machine can do that, right? So and then to the question, I didn't quite get it. Like, do you mean that, why do we try to solve tasks which are not considered a problem, or? Well,
cats and pictures is the really obvious one.
Right.
People can already spot cats and pictures, so that's not a problem that people are struggling with. So a computerized solution to that doesn't seem like the end goal. It seems like a step towards something else. What is it that you imagine AI will ultimately be able to do that is something that's beyond our capabilities?
So one other definition of AI is, for example, that it does all these types of tasks and makes all these types of decisions, and the tasks being physical or cognitive, which require capabilities that usually humans only possess. And these capabilities would be of cognitive, physical, or emotional nature. So when you think about it, and this is sort of the ambition, and this is what AI is really doing today, then that means that AI will be doing essentially many of the tasks that we are doing normally in our daily lives, like making coffee or being a nurse or being a doctor, which could be done by an AI, and it could do it with a higher level of accuracy, with more efficiency. For example, so now it won't be cats, but it would be, let's say, MRIs, right? That's a typical application domain in the medical domain, where you have MRIs, we have X-rays. There's now plenty of evidence that an AI and a machine learning algorithm can detect the abnormal patterns in MRIs much better than a radiologist. So that doesn't mean that the radiologist would lose their job tomorrow, but that task of identifying these patterns would be something that an AI is better able to do. And you as a patient then would most likely prefer such a machine or an AI to make this type of decision if it does it with 95% accuracy as a human, which might be tired, which might not be as skilled, and does it at 75% accuracy.
Right, for sure.
That'd be one example. Or, for example, the whole self-driving car movement. So in 10, 15 years' time, I don't know, do you have kids? Are they younger than 5 years or? No. But those that have kids that are younger than 5 years, those kids are unlikely to learn how to drive a car. I mean, they will not need to do that because in 15, 20 years' time, you have cars that will be self-driving. And with that also comes the safety aspect. So the cars, there won't be accidents. Virtually, if all cars or most of the cars are self-driving, there won't be any accidents. That's another thing that I'm foreseeing, which will be happening with very great likelihood. And this also brings all these unforeseen consequences, and that's why it's such a big topic in government circles and in many companies as to what will happen with people that have a job based on transport. So about 200 million people in the world, I think 400 million people in the world are involved in transporting things from A to B. Right. Things or people from A to B.
And that's not counting people who cook in roadside cafes or, all those sorts of things.
Exactly right. Exactly. Yeah. So there's plenty of open questions of how to deal with those types of challenges.
I guess with any major technological shift, you've got a load of unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Is there any way to mitigate against those, or?
I often say there's sort of two types of outcomes. One is that we look at AI technology as being like what happens with technologies in general. It usually creates in the beginning question marks, but in the long run, it creates new jobs. It creates new opportunities for people to find a way of adding value to the way how you create products or services or what it is. So that's one likely scenario when you look back at what mobile phones did or computers or electricity. Those technologies created many more possibilities for us. The other scenario, and that's also discussed quite heavily, is the future of work. So what if all these tasks that we are doing today can be automated and can be done much better? How will our future look like? What value do we have as humans in this society, right? Well, where do we stand? What is the uniqueness of us? And some people jump to things like, we can do lots of arts, the basic things will be given to us because there's food, there's transport, and medicine will be sort of automated and so on. But even that part will be used for creative tasks too, So there's lots of examples by Professor David Cope, for example, who uses AI to compose music. And he taught his AI system Johann Sebastian Bach's compositions, and it took him 7 years, but it imitated his style so well that it created new compositions, right? And it became so good that it was indistinguishable from a human playing it, for example. So
I would probably argue that the next step would be to not create music in the style of Bach, but to create music in the style of the AI. And that's perhaps where genuine creativity comes in. Do you think that's achievable?
Well, I mean, when these discussions pop up, so when I started my journey doing AI, like 25, 30 years ago almost, I got very fascinated in exactly these questions. So what's consciousness? What is creativity? What are the unique values that are perhaps the biggest challenges to create, by a machine? The first question you have to ask yourself, define what you mean by creativity. Because if you cannot define that, and this is, by the way, very difficult to define creativity, consciousness, even intelligence, then it will be very hard to, say, well, is it possible to create such a thing or not? But in principle, I see a lot of signals that we going into these directions. So everything that you can describe and define, I think there's a very high likelihood that a machine will be able to do it in one way or another.
What do you mean by intelligence?
Yeah. It is the ability to make decisions and perform tasks based on those emotional, cognitive, and physical abilities and capabilities that humans usually possess. So the way you solve problems, the way you also make the way how you make sense of data. And you essentially, I think, I look at us, and this is based on my psychology degree also, that we are essentially biological algorithm. So I take in lots of data every day, and we take actions based on that data, which go back. I remember I had many discussions and thoughts about the topic of free will. Do we actually have a free will or not? Or is it a result of essentially of who we are biologically and certain random effects that we are exposed to? So I think we are biological algorithms, essentially. Take in data, we take in impulses and observations, and then based on that, we acting in our environment and with other people.
Because not everybody thinks that. I mean, Roger Penrose, for instance, The Emperor's New Mind, basically is predicated on the idea that we're not reducible to, algorithms, that there is something more complex, more kind of ephemeral going on within the human mind. You're more essentially mechanical about how.
Well, I mean, there's no so two points to this. Like, first, there is no evidence for that to be the case. I mean, we have been for a long time. Science has been trying to find that little extra in us,
sure.
and the life sciences by and large do think of us as being exactly those types of algorithms, if you like, mechanisms. Biomechanisms in our brain and lots of other, mechanisms that we have in our body. So I think the evidence suggests at the moment that there isn't some extra thing. We're just extremely complex, and some very magic, fantastic things come out of us, either as individuals or as groups. So that would be my response. But I'm happy to take a discussion with.
Well, I was going to say, I'm drawn to the Roger Penrose argument purely because I feel like it's the more optimistic position, that there is something special about us, that there is something that isn't reproducible by machines. But that might be delusional. I mean, and is that necessarily a pessimistic view of the direction of technologies?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the thing is, when I find it terribly fascinating if something is so complex that it creates, individuals like us, us having this discussion now and having the dialogue and understanding things around us and creating music and making great food. I mean, that's very, very fascinating, and finding the mechanisms that are behind that is certainly, for me, more fascinating and intriguing than, let's say, makes it seem cold. That's my position. So yeah, I would say that's sort of my angle into this.
Right. To what extent can we be made redundant, and to what extent will that be your fault?
Exactly. So I think that is a question, right? I think when it comes to many of the jobs and tasks in the future, it is quite likely that in the coming decades we see many of these typical tasks that we are doing to disappear, from a point of view that we need to do them to earn money and to make a living, right? I think that that will disappear more and more. We're already at a stage where I don't think many people die of starvation, at least in Europe at the moment, and the overall poverty levels have come up dramatically in the world. So we're moving into this direction. And so I think there will be more of this. And this is why this very deep question, which I discussed with other of my colleagues in the community, like Francesca Rossi, for example, from IBM and the university in Italy, where we look at, well, what is the role that we should play in this highly digitized, highly data-driven future that we will be living in? And we will be living in that future in 20 or 30 years' time. And I think it's a very open question. I'm happy to debate it. And then I don't know if I should take responsibility for a scenario. I think this is certainly something that happens. Many people contribute to this transformation, and I think it's inevitable. It's just something that really you see so much need to make sense of that data, and the fact that you can use it for good things such as improving health, or removing cancer or reducing cancer risks and all these types of things. So I think people want that,
right?
And I think that's important. So I would hope that if I'm responsible for certain things to become redundant, I'm not saying that people will become redundant, but certain tasks to become redundant, that these tasks that will become redundant are those that are dangerous to people that perform them today, or that are so complex that they don't deliver the value to the individuals, to patients, for example, that they could if a machine does it, and so on. So if those types of things disappear for people, then I'd be very happy, I think.
Right. Okay. So that sort of answers my question, which is about what do you hope will happen as a result of your work. But obviously there's an economic dimension to the impact of AI, but there's also an ethical dimension to, not just can we do these things and how do we make it sustainable from an economic perspective, but should we do these things? And how do you make those decisions, and who should be involved in that discussion?
So first, I think it affects all of us. So I always encourage as many as possible to be part of this discussion, no matter who you are and where you are. I think because it affects us all, it should be very, very important and very interesting for any individual to participate in this discussion and to get to know what it is all about. So that's one. The second part I always say is that when you have these discussions, make sure that you have someone in the group or in the panel that understands the topic in its depth. Right, so you would not discuss, let's say, for example, brain surgery or cancer research or something if you do not have an expert in this area in the group. So that is just that type of message. Right. And so that's sort of the basic message. And then whom else would you want to have in this discussion? I think in the first instance for the next 10, 20 years, you would want to have those industry representatives in these meetings which would be most impacted by these types of technologies. And also, I think representatives then from certain communities, that represent people that would be mostly impacted by certain groups, perhaps, that would be mostly impacted by these types of technologies, those that are perhaps more fragile or maybe not so digitally enabled and so on. So I think that would be very important.
Because it's interesting to me that Google put together their AI ethics committee famously recently without anybody who'd studied ethics on it, and with some people with, let's say, questionable ethics. And so to what extent can we trust industry to take the lead on this?
So that's a good question. And I think we, for example, published at Tieto the Tieto AI guidelines, right, which I was very frank about. I wanted them to be in place. I said it's important for me to sleep at night. I want everyone that works with AI to know what the potential effects would be. So that I think is very important. But I said at the same time, we are not going to be the ones that have the final word on that. It's just I don't want to wait for the government or for regulators or for someone else to come up with solutions which might take years for it to come into effect, right? So we took a very proactive step in that sense. But should we be the ones taking charge of it? No, I don't think so. I think it will be perhaps taking a similar route than, for example, what happened in the medical field, right? I mean, perhaps 200 years ago, maybe even 100 years ago, there were many charlatans, that would essentially suggest, hey, here, take this and you will be healed. And so, that's why we have the FDA or Läkemedelsregister here in Sweden, the equivalent more or less, that will start looking at, what does medication actually do? And we also have the scientific method, double-blind trials, which you run 3 times, to test these. So I hope that it won't be similarly complex, because it also takes back the medical field a little bit and its speed of creating new solutions, for diseases. But I think something similar will come up, so that not everyone will be, let's say, using data which can impact people's health or people's fortune in ways which is not understood, to some level. That doesn't mean that you will understand it completely, but you will need to understand it to a level where, where it becomes useful and you understand at least some consequences.
Sure. You said you wanted to be able to sleep at night. What keeps you awake? I mean, what's the nightmare scenario?
Well, I mean, for example, when you do use, when you have data scientists, or when you start applying AI or these data-driven methods, this context now, there are other things that could, keep me awake at night. But in this context, it would be that, it will be used for purposes, and you haven't understood the consequences of these technologies. So when people get very enthusiastic, which happens a fair bit, so we are really at an age where this is so new, so fresh. People see like, wow, it can detect CATs or MRIs or what it is, right? But what is the data? Is it data that is balanced, meaning that what it detects will be equally valuable for anyone that uses the system? Is it safe enough? Is it, for example, something called adversarial attacks? So when you have something that you recognize and you can fool the system in understanding something different about the world, like self-driving cars and so on. Mm-hmm. So when you start having people being enthusiastic, rushing into this field, which happens a fair bit, right? And then the application of these technologies is not thought through. And it's a little bit, I compare this a little bit like with when you look again in medicine, because I'm also at the Karolinska Institute. I think no one in their right mind would think about, giving someone a book and a quick lesson about, how to do brain surgery, and then just give them a scalpel and say, well, just go for it. Like next week, there's some people coming in. So you need to, that is something that worries me, because in the medical world, you need a fair bit of track record before you come to that point. You need to have a pretty thorough education to understand holistically how a person functions, if you like, and then you need to have lots of practice, and then you get the scalpel under supervision of people that are experienced. And in the data science field at the moment, it's like, well, there's data, go for it. If there's some value that potentially comes out of it. But again, it's like, in immigration cases, when you apply for visas, if you give people access to certain services, making sure that everything is done as fair and as robust as would be considered reasonable and highest possible standards,
To that end, there's a lot of people talking about the transparency of the decision-making process, and we want a sort of AI that is explainable. To what extent is that realistic?
Well, in some cases, it's realistic and very feasible if you make it transparent and explainable, particularly when you have AI technologies that are not these black box approaches, such as, for example, deep learning networks and so on. So they are much less transparent and much harder to understand what they do. But if you have decision trees, for example. So I did some research and some work a few years back whereby we balanced the provenance, so the transparency against the accuracy. So, you will start having algorithms whereby you can see why and how they make the decisions, but you will have to counter that against the accuracy that it delivers, right? So it's quite feasible, but having said that, I'm aware that in Europe there are now quite a lot of efforts to make these more black box type approaches more explainable and more transparent too. Right. And I know that DARPA in the US is now, I think, spending 2.5 billion or something to make all these neural networks more explainable. But in some cases, you don't even want to make them transparent or publish them, let's say, because it makes them also more vulnerable for manipulation, right?
Sure. I mean, my example, I guess, for this is something like Alphago, which ultimately there might have been a decision tree at work, but what it was working on was essentially intuition based on data. Or at least that's what it looks like from the outside. And like there's a massive amount of data because it studied all of these historical games. But why this stone was put exactly there at this point in the game seemed unfathomable. And it seemed like that was the reason it was so good. And so are we giving something up by going, no, you need to have an if-then, decision path in order to be able to explain this? Is something lost in that?
It is, of course, hard, because in the end of the day, what you have today is like a big mathematical, massive formula, like a matrix of many weights and many data points, right? So that's all you have, which is a bit highly simplified version of what's in our brain. So you couldn't really explain precisely what's happening when you make a particular decision, right?
Sure.
Because you would have to break it down. But the case that I think was more mind-boggling is, of course, Alphago 0, right? Whereby it didn't learn at all from the wisdom of humans. It just created its own understanding of how the game should be played. And I think that was a much more mind-boggling situation, because I think it was move 42 in the game. I think it was never ever played before by any human being ever.
Wow.
And it was apparently the decisive move, right, in this entire game. And it was extremely unintuitive. Experts of the game said, well, why did the system
what sort of idiot would put that stuff?
Along those lines.
Yeah.
And so that's one part. And the second part is, as you said, it cannot be even explained. So the system, what the system got, AlphaGo 0 got, was not the data of humankind, but it received the rules of the game only. And so this is really quite a fundamental insight, and we are now really looking into, well, how can we use such a technology whereby we just give it the rules of the game, the rules of the problem, right? And then you figure out what the solution is, rather than teaching the AI based on lots and lots of data, which is today sort of the normal way of approaching it, right? That's why all the discussions about data and how much you need and all these types of things.
I'm kind of curious how we got here. I mean, there seems to have been some really big leaps in AI and in periods, like by the decade, for instance. What was the journey that got us here? And are we due for another big leap?
As you know, AI has been around for quite some time, for about 70 years, right? So the efforts were in early days. Alan Turing in 1950, published the book Can Machines Think? So it started back then. And in recent times, what got us here today and why everyone talks about AI is pretty much what happened with deep learning, recurrent neural networks, CNNs, and the insight that these neural networks, which started to fade away in the AI community, because they said, wow, they don't converge, they're complex, why do we use them, suddenly started to show, after some tweaks, immense quality improvements in how they detect certain things and how quick they are. And that really then got applicable to, for many companies like Baidu, Facebook, Google, and so on. And not just for recognition of items in books, but also for very practical industries where you recommend items like on Amazon and so on. So that really brought us to where we are today. And everyone talks about AI, but as I said earlier, it is only one part in the entire AI area. And when you ask about, well, what will be the next leap forward? I mean, one part is likely going to be in machine learning. So we have now this so-called supervised learning. So you need a lot of data. But I think one part will be this type of deep reinforcement learning. So we need much less data. And also the way where the machine learns just after few steps, so after few iterations. I think that is where a key will lie in making these systems even more effective. So when you learn something new and I show you how to pour water into a glass, you're very quickly learning that after maybe one iteration, right? So an AI system today would need 100,000 iterations of that to even start grasping what that is. And that's just recognition. It's not reasoning. It's not understanding what's happening. It's just recognizing what needs to be done. So I think, but that will be some big breakthrough, because it would essentially mean that we are not relying on huge amounts of data. We can show the system just once or a few times what needs to be done. And so I think that will be a big breakthrough also in regard to what we have currently in Europe, which is a GDPR. So the data is not flowing as fluid than, let's say, in other places in the world, like China.
Right. Because, the amount of data available, does that put us at a major disadvantage? And do you think that there's a trade-off that could be made there that would make things better?
From the perspective of building efficient AI systems quickly, it's certainly a massive challenge. I think that's without doubt.
Privacy is a problem, is what you're saying.
Well, for that particular purpose. And then don't get me wrong, I think the idea of GDPR is completely correct, right? The intention is very much correct. But I also think that the level of abstraction, like what individuals now need to do with this GDPR, I think it's above most of us. I mean, I read part of the GDPR, but I think very few people do. And when it comes to the practicalities of, clicking buttons and agreeing to the terms of conditions, very few people find that practical. And I wouldn't know. I probably have hundreds of different accounts across, hotels and airlines and I don't know where. And those profiles, I don't even know they exist anymore. I've forgotten most of them, let alone my right of being forgotten in the GDPR having any effect. So, in fact, I go around, I test sometimes these sort of systems, and I was part of a gym chain in Sweden. And then I became a member for some time, and then I wanted to test if I can remove myself out of the system, right? So say, well, delete everything. So I sent an email, I called them up, delete everything. And so it did not happen. So I could log in still, right? 3 months later, as an example. It's in principle a good idea, but I think it needs to be much more practical. It needs to have a different layer of abstraction to become useful.
Because here in Sweden, of course, everything's tied to our personal numbers. And surely that's difficult to disentangle. Is that, again, is that another problem, or is that, part of the solution?
Well, I mean, it's part of a solution when it comes to building systems that would be more effective in, for example, predicting individuals' health status or their needs, when it comes to financial loans or those types of practical things.
But my grocery shopping is tied to my personal number. So if I buy a bar of chocolate and that's tied to the same number that's tied to my medical records, there's going to be that kind of intersection of data. Should that all be one pool of data? And should machines that don't reveal that data to other human beings be able to make decisions based on that information?
Well, if you choose to do so, then I think it's fine. I mean, I think if you as an individual are completely aware of what these processes do and how the data is pulled together, and if you feel that the value that you receive as a result of those data sources coming together makes sense to you, then I think it should be done. It should then, of course, not be used for things outside of what you have agreed with that data to be done, right? So it should only be what you agreed to have done with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but there's a whole lot of uses that I'm not going to be able to imagine that other people will be able to profit from, presumably.
Not if you don't agree with it.
But what I'm saying is that I don't know what those uses are, so I have no basis on which to agree or disagree.
Well, wouldn't they need to then explain what they are, what these things would be then, no?
You tell me. I mean, we already have Facebook in the world. And Facebook, apart from the odd $3 to $5 billion fine, is broadly a legal entity that does a whole lot of stuff with our data that we just have no idea what that is. And so we don't have the opportunity to agree or disagree. And there are algorithms and neural networks at work behind the scenes, and we don't know what they do.
Yep.
Good or bad?
Okay, if that's the case, that shouldn't happen, right? I mean, and my understanding is now that Facebook, Google, many of the companies, American companies in particular, but also other companies from other countries, have to now, they got a very hefty fine, and I'm sure it made a difference in their thinking, and I do understand.
Really? Because it's like 1 month of their revenue. It's not even a dent in their annual income. Do you think that's going to change their behavior in any way?
I think it has changed their behavior. I think the pressure is higher. I mean, if you're losing trust with the users also, I mean, that's another factor, right? I mean, you have, of course, the authorities which will start putting fines on you and put pressure on you and say, well, you can't even operate here in Europe if you don't follow these laws and if you don't have your data centers here and so on. That's one part. And the other one is, of course, I think the public becomes increasingly aware of that. So I think they run a big risk and being less, let's say, losing the trust with the customer. And I think that's the most horrible scenario. I think the pressure is increasing. Did it now change everything from one day to another? Probably not, right? But I think it's going more into this direction.
I think we're becoming increasingly aware that we're living in a dystopian technological society as far as Facebook. But I don't know if there's any choices that a lot of us have in response to that. So it's a tricky one from that perspective. So apart from how we got here from AI, how did you get here? What's your story? Was this a childhood dream to become an expert in computer thinking, or tell me about the child Christian. What were you taking apart, making things work?
Yeah, I started really early getting into the whole computer world, and then I think I have sort of two parts of my character. One is that I'm very much engineer, scientific minded, I find that terribly fascinating. And I started programming when I was 13, I had a good old Commodore 64 back in the days, right? And that was good fun. And that was one part, and it got me really interested. I started watching certain movies which were perhaps not known for their enormously great acting skills, like for example Knight Rider or something. So I was a little slightly embarrassed here to say that, but I think the point there wasn't the great acting, but I was very fascinated in this car which had intelligence to support people. Right, it was one of these first examples in the science fiction world where you had an AI system having a personality, and having the ability to communicate and understand its environment in the 80s and 70s.
I think that's the real difference too. It actually, this goes back to your definition of intelligence. It was making decisions, but it was actually aware, and it was sentient. And I think, is that the target? Is that what?
That was certainly also the first questions I had when I started my PhD, right? So I think my one of my PhD supervisors was saying, well, Christian, you can't just talk about consciousness. That's such a loaded term, right? You need to start specifying it. Awareness, essentially, having self-awareness. And it gets you very quickly into philosophical topics, right? And it also starts... at least for me, I realized that it is just so hard to define that. It's not defined. That's why it isn't defined, right?
Right.
So, but yeah, that's certainly one fascination. How can you build some entity that has that awareness, that has the ability to make connections to others and, sets its own goals, takes its own initiatives, was certainly one of the many fascinating topics at the time. And then the other part of my personality, let's say, is to find out how we humans work. And that is what brought me down the path of studying psychology and understanding when and how we make decisions and I think one reason why we are intelligent is also we need this ability to work with each other. I think that is a very big point. And I use these lessons learned in psychology and try to transfer them into how we build AI systems, essentially. So that was something that definitely fascinated me early on, I'd say.
What did your parents do, and how did that affect where you've ended up?
So in those days, I think I was one of the few at the whole school that had this computer type, slightly nerdy, nerdy path. And I think my parents overall saw, from a practical point of view, I think parents tend to be more practical. What's my kids are going to do, and what will they be? And so they were happy to see overall that, well, it seems one part of what he's doing is IT and computers, and everyone tells us that stuff will be the future. So they were, I think, generally quite happy. When it came to the whole AI part, I think it's always more difficult to explain it, I guess, on a high level. So I broke it down. So my PhD thesis, for example, back in the days when I explained it to my mom and my grandma, which was always it's a good exercise, by the way. If you do highly complex thing, you break it down to something very practical. Sure. But it turned out to be quite explainable. It's like how you have several AIs and how they make decisions with each other in an optimal way, right? So it became, they thought, well, it sort of makes sense, at least the way how I explained it. So they were quite content with me moving into this direction.
Were they in the kind of scientific world at all?
Not so much, no. Actually, so my mom worked much more as a chef, for example. She was more hands-on when it came to the food and cooking and those types of things. And that's maybe in part some of my papers, they had examples in cooking in it, right? So how would you make an AI collaborate with others to create a dish or something of that sort? So I wouldn't be surprised if that had an influence, from where she comes from, but it was more practical.
Sure. Where were you growing up? Because you're sort of German, Australian, you've lived in Dubai, you mentioned. What's the geographic story?
Yeah, so I still grew up, I feel, I'm still growing up in the sense that, every experience that I have is influencing me and how I'm thinking about the world, about my life.
Taking in more data, processing.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly, maybe changes.
Developing the algorithm.
Exactly right. Spot on. But I grew up physically. I was in Germany when I was young. And then I also stayed in Luxembourg a fair bit because I had good friends that, we were working from a computer perspective and AI perspective together. And then I moved to Australia, did much of my education there. So I think before I came to Sweden, I was really a lot in Australia, and I could say much less of what happened in Germany over the last 30 years or so, I'd say. And then I would say that, as you said, Dubai, I was in Japan for some time, and those experiences are really orthogonal in my world, because when you live in Western countries, Sweden, Germany, Australia, US, is by and large, it's about the same value settings, right? It's
sure.
not, but if you start living in the Middle East or in Japan, for me at least, it was I became very humbled about, looking at those value systems that exist there and seeing people, how they live, and how they prosper and how they live with each other, which is just very different. So it's a true culture shock, and I think, and that's something that humbled me, and I think it gave me a very different perspective on what's happening, for example, in Sweden or in the Nordic countries and so on.
Has that affected how you approached AI?
I would say so. For example, one thing is that I hope I get this together, but in Japan and I think also in China, the view on how AI will become part of daily life is much more inviting. So I think they have a much more open concept as to what could be part of society. That's why robots, for example, are, let's say, not considered to be a strange externality that will somehow invade our life and it's cold and so on. And that's some lessons that I learned over time. So the approach to those types of technologies are much more inclusive in some sense than in Europe. So I think, and that also makes me, again, when I think about the AI ethics guidelines and so on, trying to not have too many or a more global outlook on those types of guidelines, and in making sure that we have a representation of different thoughts and different value systems, as much as makes sense, to find a common view. So that's certainly one thing. And then just from a practical perspective, you see that, again, countries like Japan have been investing very, very heavily into robotics. So they see the applications in hospitals where a robot can lift a patient from one bed to another, or taking, for example, drones or robots in rescue scenarios. So they're much more open and integrating these types of technologies in their environment, I would say. So that's certainly an eye-opener. And I understand this much, much better after having been in societies where I needed to adopt and understand and accept different sort of value systems.
Right. One of the things I've noticed while you've been talking about AI is that it seems to be that the intelligences or the algorithms in question are task-specific. Yeah, find pictures of cats, move a patient from bed A to bed B. Can we generalize intelligence in computers?
That is one of those big questions, right? So for the listeners, there's this concept of narrow artificial intelligence, right, which you just described. It's an AI that does a task really, really well, maybe really, really quick and very accurate, right? And that's narrow AI, like, identification, recognition. And then there's the term artificial general intelligence, which you're probably referring to, which is starting to be an AI that has a much higher level. So it will be able to do all the tasks that we will be doing at the same level. So, and then there's actually also the term which lies in the middle. It's called artificial broad intelligence. And that's what we would be aiming for at Tieto, whereby you can start having a system do 2 or 3 tasks together really well. Mm-hmm. So instead of just focusing on one thing very well, you start combining them. So having a chatbot that can, for example, also detect whether you have certain needs or you might have a problem in the way how you, in your health or something of that sort. So you start combining certain AI technologies in this, in this framework of AI. And so was the question also like, can we achieve that? Or
I guess, yeah. I mean, an example would be, there's an AI that can spot a Frisbee in a photo, but wouldn't have any clue what summer is.
Yeah.
Can we get there?
You can divide roughly these 2 areas where you have recognition of things, right? Which is what you said, you can see a Frisbee, and then you have reasoning, right? That's completely different. Seeing that something exists doesn't mean you know what it is. Yep. And there's a lot of work on that too, which is we're much further away from having a big breakthrough in that area. But having said that, some of these decision tree algorithms and so on, or for example planning, there's a big area in artificial intelligence which is called autonomous planning, essentially, whereby you let systems plan out a very, very complex set of actions and are essentially able to react to changes in the environment. So it needs to have a certain level of awareness, right? And so the reasoning as to how you would create this plan is sort of in the plan creation. So it's not like there's nothing when it comes to reasoning and the awareness of the system or what it means to throw the frisbee or something, but we're certainly much further away from that as being a breakthrough, that.
Sure. And the next level of abstraction beyond that, I guess, is metaphor and, poetic thinking and that sort of thing, which I guess comes back to our conversation of, essentially, are the musicians safe?
Yeah, exactly. Well, safe from what, I mean, that's the thing. Like, maybe it will be a liberation too, right? But yeah, you're right. And it was an algorithm. I try to remember the use case. It was actually detecting sarcasm. Right. In texts and jokes, right? And it was detecting them, I think, at 80% accuracy in certain documents, and therefore would highlight in which documents it would be. And there was a very nifty use case for that type of thing, I think it might have been used in a company where you would see, what documents were written or what emails. Was it emails? I don't know. Maybe we go into territory we don't want to go into. But it was essentially then detecting, could learn what that meant, But
then again, it's a further step to actually then being sarcastic itself when it felt like it. So I think that's an interesting thing. I guess the final thing I have from an industry perspective is there an industry that's going to be untouched by this? Are there people out there going, well, at least my business is safe from this because we just keep making what we make? Or is that kind of a naive perspective?
I think in the long run, it's a naive perspective, in the long run. So there will certainly be certain areas which will be safer. I'd say will be less touched, but I think all of them will be touched. I think there's no doubt. And the general rule of thumb is that if the tasks that you're doing are very data-driven and are somewhat repetitive, it's much more likely they will be impacted earlier. So, and those that require, let's say, much more variability in how you perform it and might be really based on the situation that you're in, they might be safer for longer. So, for example, there's this example with doctors. When a medical doctor makes a differential diagnosis, they should do that based on data, right? They would see you at your blood values and check you out and so on. They slowly work their way towards a diagnosis, right? And that's very data-driven. Whereas, for example, a nurse that deals with patients on an individual basis, they need to be much more aware of very many idiosyncratic sort of situations and people's personalities and so on. So their job, let's say, would be much further in the future to be impacted in some sense. But overall, I think it's pretty clear, and the estimates by many analysts and many of my colleagues, such as, for example, Kai-Fu Lee and so on, there's many that make estimates, and I agree with them. And I have my own calculations that perhaps in the next 10, 12 years, 50% of jobs will be quite heavily impacted, if not completely replaced even,
Right.
But again, in the next 10, 20 years, those replaced jobs will at least in the next 20 years be replaced with, I think, much more exciting roles and tasks.
Right.
But in the very long run, I think we really need to sit down and really rethink our role in society, I think. Yes.
I'm going to end with a philosophical question, and I think I know what Kai-Fu Lee would answer this, but I'm interested in your answer, which is if we are simply super, super complex algorithms and we're creating artificially other super, super complex algorithms that may in many ways replace us, does it fundamentally matter if we do ultimately get phased out?
Yeah. Matter to whom? That would be the first question, the counter question. So.
Well, I know it matters to me, but in the grand scheme of things, does it make any difference if it's us here or them?
So from if you ask me personally, or if you were to ask me from an evolutionary perspective, right, this would be like another step forward in the evolutionary ladder. Arguably, actually, this would be breaching the entire Darwin theory, because actually this is not how evolution works, right? You're not meant to be.
This is not selection. This is
right.
Self-imposed
Exactly
replacement.
right. It breaks the whole idea about Darwinism and evolution. But if that was to happen, to whom would it matter? Well, to humanity it would matter then, obviously, right? And but one could also look at it as being the step that we move forward in the way how our journey is meant to be going forward. So for me, it matters in the sense that I would be sad that it would happen, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe we need to now I'm making this up a little bit, right? A philosophical question, as you said, but maybe we need some type of sanctuaries in the future for humans, right? That we have these species that once existed and were the peer of the
human zoo.
Yeah, something along those lines, Some I think you can find some jokes of that sort also on the internet, but that is a scenario. But again, we look very far into the future, and then there are many, many question marks as to whether we would reach such a situation.
Yeah.
But
I guess the provocation would be that the way to think about this would be we're not building something that is other to us. What we're building is us. And if what we're doing is essentially trying to replicate human intelligence and trying to then essentially, the sort of the meat version of us being phased out doesn't matter, because there's still an us that continues.
That's one way to look at it. I encourage, now that we going towards the end of the discussion, but there's also this very good book, which is sort of the standard reading for those that study artificial intelligence. It's a book called Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach by Russell and Norwick. And the first chapter this is a very technical book, but in the first chapter you see 4 different ways of looking as to what the goals of AI would be. Mm-hmm. And one of those is what you mentioned, that some AI researchers are working to build something that is just like us. But others believe, for example, that AI will be just mimicking us, so it will never be like us. It will just be a mimic, like a puppet. And then there's another category which suggests that it is actually completely its own intelligence. Mm-hmm. So, and personally, I actually prefer to call it machine intelligence and not artificial intelligence, because what type of intelligence and the actions that come out of these systems, I think they will be having the nature of the machine, its own character, like fractals in mathematics, like you have these very complex patterns, and I think it will be that type of personality, if you even want to call it that, and it may not be at all like it is like us. It will be possibly completely different. We might not be even able to understand how it would work.
I have to say that would be my preference. I think that we create, because like I said before, we can already identify cats in photographs. Why don't we build intelligences that can do things that we can't currently do, which brings us to not artificial intelligence, but augmented intelligence to help people think further and deeper and reach further. Is that on anybody's agenda, or am I just wishful thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I agree. Like this, it's also this idea of augmented workforce, for example. How can you, when you look more practically, like employees and so on, how can you upgrade them in some sense? How can you give people abilities that they don't have today? Like either like very hands-on, like almost towards cybernetics and, cyborg type ideas, which is sort of in part happening already, because people have already technology installed in them, if you like, that will bring them forward. But also in ways where what you're doing today in a small way, you can enhance these things much smarter and quicker by using AI. When you search for documents or any of the tasks that you do today, which would be tedious and take a long time, or which might even be dangerous, right?
Sure.
So you would be upgraded in that sense.
And it seems to also reveal new human abilities that we didn't know we had, which I think is a really interesting potential for the technologies.
That's a good point too, exactly. I mean, we certainly, if you think about it, it has happened many times before with technology. When you think of music and, electronic music, the type of music that's created today and 20, 30, 40 years ago, coming from a machine, from a pulp with these microprocessors, has created a completely new category of music genres, right? Which have influenced our emotions and the way how we react to the world in completely different ways. So yeah, along those types of thinking, I can completely see that. And you think of other examples, like, you know, the whole internet phenomena and the whole social networking part, whereby when we react on Twitter to people, we don't even know who they are often. I mean, we have no clue who they are. They might be somewhere at the other end of the world, and we talk to people which we have never seen, will never see, right? Yeah. And so this technology changes ways. And I agree with you. And then you could become, again, philosophical. Is that the right way to do it or the wrong way to do it? Because I have friends that don't like digital music at all. Electronic music is like, go away with that stuff, right? It's either classical or heavy metal and guitars, right? And so but others embrace it as, you know, the new way of experiencing things in the world.
And I guess on that note, artificial intelligence is a broadening of our palette of technologies rather than abandoning the old and embracing the new, as some people think that you need to do for electronic music.
I think so. I think so too. Yeah.
Christian, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Christian Guttmann, Vice President, Global Head of Artificial Intelligence and Chief AI and Data Scientist at Tieto, and almost certainly real human person. And that's the MTF podcast. If you enjoyed, please do share it with someone else, like it on Facebook, subscribe on your podcast player of choice, and do let us know. We'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, have a great week, and we'll talk soon. Cheers.